You mentioned the neocon kind of view of ideology as being the salient, kind of like the prism that they're looking at Iran at. So how can you describe why the Democrats are also kind of following this line, the same kind of inheriting the same policies that the Bush administration left?
That's a good question. I think it gets back to something we were alluding to earlier, or I think Kaveh was mentioning, that there really isn't much of a vision within the Democratic Party as to what where to go with the larger region. And I think part of it goes back to the fact that early on the Obama administration did try to reach out to the Iranians and was rebuffed. And it's kind of unfortunate. There was a moment when the Iranians reached out to us and we rebuffed them. There was a moment where we were reaching out to them, they rebuffed us. So we kind of fell back into a kind of traditional pattern, and quite frankly, the ship of state is something that has an enormous amount of inertia. The last comment on that is I would say that this is kind of a larger fault of the Democratic Party. That love them or hate them, the neoconservatives have a vision for the region, and it's called benign global hegemony. And it's not necessarily a vision that I think is actually operable, let alone salutary. But at least they've got a vision. Whereas the Democrats tend to kind of fall back into the traditional pattern of American foreign policy. We have the rhetorical commitment to human rights and democracy and expanding democratic enlargement and the expansion of capitalist integration. But when push comes to shove, we back the Saudis and we back the Israelis. And so it seems to me that what we really need is it's a broader systemic, and if we can kind of have this in the larger spring, we really need a fundamental reevaluation of American foreign policy in the region. And Iran is just one component of that broader reevaluation. But,
Hello, and I wanted to thank Ahmad for finally bringing the discussion back to the Arab Spring, because it seems like the nuclear issue of Iran and the United States so distorts the discussions that almost the entire panel forgot about the Arab Spring, and you finally wrapped it up fairly nicely. One thing that I wanted to ask you about the Arab Spring and the potential of it is that not only just the realpolitik sense of it, which you covered, but I think in a way why this whole thing is very threatening, both to Iran and the United States, is that it represents a paradigm shift in terms of the analysis of the region. That how we have been so focused on the details and the minutiae of the apparatus of state and the balance of power within them. And then all of a sudden, civil society comes in, 2009 in Iran, and boom, puts 3.5 million people on the streets within 72 hours after the elections. And then what happens in Cairo and all of that. I don't think anybody knows how to assess this new 800-pound gorilla in the internal politics of these countries in the Middle East. And they're all trying to kind of get a measure of it. And the only thing that I see so far from the Iranian government and the Office of the Supreme Leader is the national security paradigm approach to this. He is trying to solve essentially a political and a civil society issue through a national security paradigm. And I think that's bound to be a failure. The other thing is that in terms of the realpolitik aspect of what you talked about, there has been 30 years of vested interest in politics of Iran and the United States not engaging one another. And all these other countries, from Saudi Arabia to UAE to Israel, all are vested to have a check on the American policy towards Iran. So the bilateral issue that you talked about is not only, yes, I recommend it, it's feasible, but it also faces internal obstacles in this country, in the sense that all these nations who don't want to take on Iran one-on-one, they want to exploit this antagonistic relationship between Iran and the United States, and they want to have a check on that policy. How do you resolve that issue?
Oh boy. Well, let's try not to go into that, but I will touch on that comment. It's a very good question and good elaboration. And most importantly, you're right, the relations between the United States and Iran have many moves in the background. And we have to acknowledge that. The peace dividend has to be increased. but to increase that, it would be stepping toes on the Saudis, the Israelis, even the Russians and the Chinese. You must understand, like, as the US is losing out in Iran, the Russians and Chinese are gaining. So it should not be mistaken that the isolation of Iran and sanctions on Iran, and as Kaveh has mentioned, Iran has 32 years of going around these sanctions. You know, when the tankers of the Bandar Abbas come out, the oil tankers, there are little ships that come, take the oil, and you know, briefcases full of crisp $100 notes or transactions are like that. Put as many sanctions as you want, those transactions are not going to stop. So you must understand that yes, there's vested interest both in the sort of like friends camp of Iran to keep the status quo, and those who view Iran as a threat. So not only do we have to worry about the Israeli dilemma, we have to worry about the Chinese dilemma. You know, when you go to the P5 meetings and like, you'll see like, you see the fighting in there, and the Chinese and the Russians are going to say, okay, fine, we water it down, we sign it, but nothing really changes. You know, they will make some big statements, big items that they will stop. But we all know that the best mafiosa black market system that is being run by the Iranian regime. And you must not forget the borders of Iran are controlled by the Basij. Everything comes in and everything goes out, has to go through the system. So as Kaveh said, the legitimate businessman of Iran has died. The sanction and isolation has created a mafia-driven economy, a shadow economy, which is massive. And so the Saudis want to keep their own interests in place. But the irony of all of this is that it is the gorilla that you mentioned, the 800-pound gorilla. There's a 400-pound elephant that is also around there. And that is basically the enormous potential between the US and Iran. If they actually sit down, they have so much common interest. You want to stabilize Afghanistan and Iraq? Okay, we do it. You want to like, you want to, get the oil security out of the Persian Gulf? Don't worry, everything will be fine. Hormuz never closed. I mean, what I'm saying is that like, it's important to acknowledge that like, US has put the blindfolds on, and it's been fed with completely. It's amazing how they're going against the national interest. If they realize what market they're messing up, go to Iran. Economy may be bad, but people don't like the government, but somehow everybody makes it too. So it's irony. The space is closed, but somehow things trickle in. So in my opinion, US is losing out. It is Israel and Saudis and the rest, and the Chinese and the Russians. Basically, the rest are enjoying their interests. So I hope one day we'll have a direct flight and we'll have a great time.
I want to add just one thing that hasn't been explicitly noted, and that is we've been talking as if there were rational actors in the United States, and there are rational actors, but their principal rational capabilities are directed towards getting reelected. And so we have to understand that with an election in November of 2012, and another very important voice in this discussion, which we haven't mentioned, is of course France. President Sarkozy is up for re-election in 2012, and so they are picking up really the lowest common denominator of beating the drum, American nationalism, French nationalism, and beating up on the Iranians, which tends to be pretty popular with the publics of those countries as a way to secure, in the case of Obama, re-election, the case of individual Republican candidates in this country winning the nomination, and certainly the same in France with Sarkozy. So it's going to be a tough year to get any rational foreign policy out of these two countries.
Let me just make a quick comment on that, because I actually did have a section on the Arab Spring that I dropped out because I was just going on too long. But there was a very interesting article by Rob Malley and Hussein Agha in the New York Review of Books a few weeks ago, about counter-revolution in the Arab Spring. And what I liked about it is, he said that, this ties into the first point of your question, that the Arab Spring thrust new players into the dynamic. into regional politics. And so now we have kind of three different levels of analysis that we need to kind of look at when we look at the region. One is the the society versus or the people versus the state, and then different factions within society against other factions within society, and then but you still have that interstate dynamic. So you got like three levels of actors playing playing out, or three different dynamics playing out. In some respects, the early Arab Spring really was just the people versus the state. But now that we're getting into elections in places like Tunisia and Egypt, we'll see where it goes with Syria and Libya. But now you're seeing the different groups within the societies now fighting out. But you also have behind the scenes states, and their rivalries are being played out within these different societies. And so you have this strong counter-revolutionary push with the Saudis funding different groups and trying to try to influence the outcome in the same way that the Turkish government is and the Iranian government is. Now on top of all that, and this is the second point I want to make, is that there is a certain amount of institutional inertia within the U.S., and this comes back to Mohammed's earlier comment, that we've been dealing with militaries for so long that those are all our connections. And I see this definitely in Egypt. I mean, we don't really have connections to, definitely not the labor movement, let alone the youth movement, let alone the Islamists. So, I mean, quite frankly, who makes American foreign policy? Militaries everywhere, State Department is not. So there is this institutional inertia that's still kind of dealing with things in a way that kind of fosters this, Saudi-Iranian rivalry, Israel-Iranian rivalry, U.S.-Iranian rivalry. So even though the Arab Spring is broken, it's now got to clear that, the fundamental dynamics are going to change American foreign policy.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're past our due date, so I would ask you to join me in thanking the panelists for their great presentations. And we learned a lot about the astounding complexity of the Iranian system and the difficulties of the foreign policy of the United States in relationship to that country. Thank you and good night.